Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
The headlines around our two-state region continue to proclaim expansions, new development, robust real estate for sure, new jobs added, record philanthropic engagement, major and minor corporate relocations, etc., etc. The news is good. The transportation and infrastructure part, not so much. Happy holidays. Welcome back to the most widely watched source of business and public policy discussion in the Carolinas. I am Chris William, and still fairly fresh from many local and municipal elections earlier in November, is there political leadership that can and will deploy much-needed roads and transit assets? Certainly communities and businesses are on board, and that underscores especially in places like Columbia following the Midlands biblical proportion flooding in October, and urban cores like Charlotte, where gridlock is no longer relegated only to rush hour. This and other key issues are on our agenda this time, and later on, longtime AAA Carolina CEO Dave Parsons.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Grady Johnson, President and Group Publisher of SC Biz News, Jeff Michael, Director of the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute, and special guest Dave Parsons, President and CEO of AAA of the Carolinas. Here's Chris William.
Hello, happy weekend, and welcome to our program. Guys, welcome. Good to have you back.
Thank you.
Glad to be back.
You know, here we are a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks after a lot of local elections in the Carolinas. Mm-hmm. Grady, we saw some things surprising. Charleston went through this post-Riley period now. Yep. What's going to happen to Charleston without Mayor Riley? But it's not just in Charleston, but it's in places across the Carolinas that there's some change. What do you think is driving political change? Is it demographic or is it political?
Well, I think the stupid thing, all politics is local, right? But it really is different in a lot of different places. Down in the Charleston region, a lot of it's being driven by a reaction to the rapid growth, and so I'm seeing a knee-jerk reaction to all of this growth, and so the sort of anti-growth people seem to have really prevailed in a lot of the local elections down there, and it's a passionate issue. People don't like change, and change is coming.
Let me stay with you just a second. I promise I'm going to get a chance to weigh in on this stuff. Charleston has been fairly provincial in some ways and parochial in some ways, and Charleston likes to think it's seceded from the rest of the South to some degree, and I say that because I love the place. Is Charleston, you talk about a lot of the anti-growth voice showing up in elections and winning some key seats. Is Charleston ready for prime time when it comes to being a vibrant, growing urban core, ready to take on some of those issues like transportation, like racial, like class? Are they ready?
I think it is. I think that, when you say Charleston, you have to also understand that when we say Charleston, we mean the whole region. So if you're talking about Charleston as the actual city, I think the city is ready. I think some of the suburban areas, like I'm a resident of Mount Pleasant, and Mount Pleasant is having this backlash against growth, and that I think is somewhat unhealthy. The interesting thing for me is all the focus has been on the election, who's going to replace Mayor Riley. The thing that's not really being talked about a lot is Keith Summey in North Charleston was reelected in 60-something%, majority, so somewhat of a landslide. I think the next 40 years belong to North Charleston, not Charleston.
Yeah, that's interesting. He's a longtime mayor, Keith Summey. Let's go to North Carolina for a second, Jeff. So coming out of the election, municipal elections, was interesting. Now, Raleigh City Council does not have a Republican on City Council. While that's surprising, it's not really surprising. Charlotte now, Republicans lost some leverage in Charlotte, and that's not just Charlotte and Raleigh. It's shown up in other places. Is this in response to a fairly far-reaching, some people say overreaching, Republican North Carolina General Assembly?
I'm not sure we know the answer to that yet. I think we're going to have to look at these local elections within the context of some statewide races and some legislative seat races to really be able to understand whether or not there's a backlash element happening. I personally believe that a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the trending towards Democrats in our urban cores is really more of a demographic shift. Most of the growth that we've seen since the recession is taking place in our urban cores. It tends to be a demographic that's younger, that is more diverse, that leans more Democratic. So, like Grady, though, I think you have to look beyond that general trend in the urban cores and look at the nuances of the metropolitan regions. And in that respect, I think you're right. All politics are local. And here in Charlotte, for example, in the northern suburbs of Huntersville, Cornelius, Mecklenburg, Davidson, there's been a lot of discussion about the plans to widen Interstate 77 with toll roads. There's been a lot of opposition to that. And what we saw in the most recent election is a four-term mayor of Huntersville losing election in large part, many observers believe, because of that toll issue.
And this was a female mayor.
That's right.
Jill McSwain?
Jill Swain.
Jill Swain. Was she surprised by that? Not to go down this rabbit hole too far.
I don't know Jill very well. I think I saw some post-election comments where she felt like it was tied to the toll issue, where there was such vehement opposition, and much of that opposition saying that they will continue that discussion and that campaign even into the statewide elections next year. So that's going to be something interesting to watch, because it does play out in terms of policy, like transportation, these very tough decisions that we face in terms of how do we pay for these amenities and infrastructure.
I want to circle back around transportation just a second. Before we leave the political arena, I find it interesting. You talk about the Huntersville mayor being a female mayor. It's interesting. You think about it, and so in South Carolina, you've got, of course, Nikki Haley, female governor. Second term, fairly entrenched, has a rising stock and all of those things about a bright political future. But Nikki Haley has done a fairly good job getting like faces on her direct reports and cabinets. In other words, it's a bit of a good old girls club. Not wrong or not right, just is what it is. In North Carolina, the top four urban regions, Charlotte, Raleigh, Greensboro, Asheville, all have female mayors. Does that mean something?
I think in many ways it's a reflection of, a decade ago, where there was a real emphasis on getting more women involved in local politics. And you certainly saw that on city councils, county commissions, compared to what it had been in previous decades. And I personally believe this rise to the leadership position at the mayor level, at the governor's level, is just the opportunities have begun to present themselves for some very experienced women who have already, sort of proven themselves in the trenches at that lower level where many of them got involved in past years. What's going to be interesting, though, is to see if they bring a different focus and emphasis on local issues or statewide issues because of their gender. I don't know if we know that yet, but will there be a greater focus on issues like education, for example, instead of business recruitment or roads and infrastructure? I think the verdict's still out on that.
What do you think, Grady?
Well, I think it's not a time for a victory lap at all. I think the South Carolina, and to some degree North Carolina, are still woefully behind national averages. If you look at women in leadership positions in the legislature or in corporate boards and all of those other places where you see opportunities for leadership, we lag way behind. So we've got a lot of work to do there, and these are some shoots and leaves, but this is not this is not some cause for celebration. It could just be a blip. We've really got to do a lot of work to get women in leadership positions.
In about a minute, it's not going to be enough time to do it, but we never have enough time to do, the big issues. Transportation, transit, infrastructure policy. Is there going to be a spring? Is there going to be a new day in finding money for transportation in South Carolina, sooner rather than later?
Well, I tend to be a little pessimistic in terms of how things get done through the legislature and whatever, but one thing that, and hope is not a strategy, but one of the things that I'm hoping is that all of this flooding, that all the roads that were damaged and the influx of some federal funding provides some cover for folks who have been somewhat intransient on these issues to change and vote for some things and maybe get some things done. That's my full hope is that happens.
Yeah, Jeff, what do you think? Transportation in North Carolina.
It was interesting in the news recently. I think finally Paul Ryan, I believe, was able to push through a new transportation spending bill, and we had the Transportation Secretary, former Charlotte Mayor, here a few weeks ago announcing funds for a new transit center in the core of Charlotte. I think it's going to be interesting in these last 2 years as we have a president who is on his way out and a transportation secretary who has local connections, a general election coming up at the state level, to see if we might see some alliances emerging that we haven't seen in recent years. Maybe that's the hopeful side, to see some major players that we have from the Carolinas in transportation policy circles actually trying to see something happening. That's the positive side, the hopeful side.
That's what to watch. Okay, speaking of policy, we'll have more those that make public policy on this program. He represents the 2nd Congressional District in South Carolina. Congressman Joe Wilson will be here next week on our program. And then coming up in a couple more weeks, the freshman senator. Sounds funny, but he's been around for a while, but he is the freshman senator from the Tar Heel State. Tom Tillis will also be on our program talking more about how the sausages are made, so to speak. So car care, insurance, the largest travel agency in the Carolinas. Our guest is the president and chief executive officer of the iconic AAA Carolinas and has done for almost a quarter of a century. He joins us again. We welcome back to the program Dave Parsons. Mr. President, welcome. Good to have you here.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So not bad. Almost 25 years in a role that you started just part-time or meant to just do it for a little while?
I never planned on being anywhere for 25 years, but it's been a great run. We're nearly to 2 million members in the 2 Carolinas. Own 2 insurance companies, operate 37 automotive repair and centers, and biggest travel agency in 2 Carolinas.
So David, you have more than a passing interest in transportation, certainly in cars, but transportation and policy. You heard what we talked about on the front of the show, but you also read a lot and are much more in the weeds around transit and transportation policy than we are. You've heard the political rhetoric. You hear what businesses and communities say. What does AAA say about what it needs to be?
Well, there's no doubt about the size or the magnitude of the backlog of the deferred maintenance nationally. And something needs to be done. The longer we put it off, the worse the problem gets. We think there's plenty of opportunity to raise taxes, especially given where gas pricing has gone. To raise gasoline taxes in this country, both on a federal and a state level.
Yeah, some people say that, I'm not saying that you said this, but some people say that raising taxes in an environment where we're posting less miles on our car, trying to be more efficient is a finite answer to that question. How do you come down?
Well, the funding has to come from someplace.
Yeah.
It has to get done. The national or federal gas tax has not been raised in 20 years. North Carolina last year decreased taxes, and South Carolina has not moved it in 30 years. So if you were just to adjust that for inflationary pressure, the normality of the taxes should be significantly more than they are today.
Mm-hmm. Grady?
Dave, how are you thinking about some of these disruptive technologies like Uber and Airbnb? How does that change your thinking? It's been 25 years in that chair. How's that evolving in terms of what the association is going to do?
Well, the disruptive technologies, some are just that, and the trend has been to own, with the younger generation, to own fewer cars, ride share, car share, and we're looking at ways that if the U.S. fleet decreases, how it is that we might participate in that, either providing those ride share cars or other ways to participate in that demographic shift.
So where's the most obvious place for you to join in?
It is likely going to be in maybe providing fleets that and places that for switch over and creating systems with which to do that. I think we're naturally aligned to do it.
Interesting.
Well, continuing with the technology questions, we hear a lot today about the future of driverless cars. I know AAA has done a lot of work around distracted drivers and texting while driving. We also, with the whole discussion about healthcare, we talk about the cost, but how are these changing technologies, how are they impacting the cost of car insurance and the cost of transportation beyond just funding of transportation?
We really haven't seen it yet. Most all of that driverless technology is still in a developmental stage. Will it help in the distracted driving elements? I certainly hope so, because distracted driving today is coming to epidemic proportions. We've got to do something. Our research tells us that it's just as dangerous to drink and drive as it is to text and drive. And our penalties and laws surrounding distracted driving really need to change significantly.
So where's the tipping point for that? Is it when, we have X amount, and I hate to say it this way, it sounds very morbid, but when we have X amount of folks that die in wrecks?
I think that's what it took for drinking and driving, and MAD pushed an awful lot of that. Our foundation is going to work an awful lot on awareness of texting and driving. It is just killing. I've spoken to mothers and brothers and sisters who have been victimized by this, and it's just it's continued. There doesn't seem to be an end to it.
Is there, North Carolina, sorry, Grady, I promise I'm going to give you a chance here. Would South Carolina ever have, could you ever see these two southern states ban the use of phones in the car like some others have done?
If it were to happen, I think it would happen in North Carolina well before it happened in South Carolina. South Carolina, you get caught texting and driving, you have a $25 fine and no points. There's no teeth in getting anything done. I think the next progression might be a hand or non-handheld devices, but you still have mind share going to the distraction.
Yeah.
Do you think you could work with the car manufacturers? I mean, South Carolina is now becoming, a center for car manufacturing. Kind of get in at the OEM level and equip cars to prevent this kind of stuff. If you get the car makers behind it, do you think that's a good strategy?
Well, the devices themselves are mobile and are not getting built into cars anymore. So it can better probably be accomplished at the device maker. At the digital carrier level, where if that device is sensed to be moving, it ought to shut down, and if it doesn't work, you can't use it.
So when we talk about transportation, a lot of times, I know AAA has done work around this, where you look at the impacts of gas prices on traveling, tourism, even something like crashes in terms of more people on the roads. We've been going through a period of falling gas prices. What, from your vantage point, have you seen as the impacts here in the Carolinas of that?
Well, we've seen it's certainly stimulated travel and tourism. You're today at, I think, $2.06 as an average. We all have in our very recent memory where $4 was the kind of the number, and production's even slowed down in the U.S. because the price of crude won't support continued production. So I think it has been a real stimulus to the economy, certainly a stimulus to tourism.
Jeff was talking in the Charlotte region about this idea that the congestion in traffic and transportation is reached epic proportions and past a tipping point now. Your organization is headquartered in the Charlotte region. There is a very contentious battle going on around a toll road in North Mecklenburg County, points north of Charlotte. How do you come down on tolls? Do you think there's a place for that?
I think there's a place for tolls if we have alternative free transportation. If a new road is being proposed to be built that's needed, the first solution isn't a toll road. But especially if we can privatize toll roads, we've got to seek alternatives to funding, and we've got to be fairly innovative in how to do that. And privatizing toll roads, as was done, I think, down in Hilton Head, and some of them work, some of them don't, but you don't have bondholders sitting there and holding bonds in the public. So.
Does North Carolina, will the proposed toll road I-77 north of Charlotte, is that something that needs to happen now?
I think it is. You know, if you go, gridlock has its cost on transportation, on commerce, and we've seen that, and having to come back too late on 45 to make expansions there. We've got to we just continue to fail to get ahead of the curve on everything transportation.
Yeah, great.
Are you guys advocating for more public transportation? It seems sort of contra to what you do. You want more members driving cars, but on the other side of that, are you guys involved in that public policy debate on more public transportation?
We have been, and the question in the Carolinas is, do we have the density to support public transportation? You know, do we need, where's kind of the funding tip on that? And what kind of ridership and what kind of subsidies do we need to make? Could we have otherwise taken those subsidies and put them into roads, and what do we end up with? And in highly urban cities, it makes a lot of sense. Once you get in the Carolinas, where we really, our urban centers don't approach the New Yorks and the Washingtons and the like, it really brings into question whether or not it makes sense for us.
Jeff?
So we're in the last year or 2 years of President Obama's administration, where we have, perhaps for the first time, I'm not sure, a U.S. Secretary of Transportation from the Carolinas. From your vantage point, has that had an impact in the work that you do? Has it given you an opportunity to champion certain issues around transportation here in the Carolinas that perhaps you felt like you didn't have that same access to in the past?
No, I don't really think it has. I think that Secretary Fox has done a great job, and I think he needs, you know, the thing he can move is get greater focus on the solutions to the problems. And that can't happen at his level. It's got to happen at the lawmaker level. And the more he can do to help make that happen will benefit all of us.
Yeah, we've got about a minute and a half left, David. What is the long-term, is there a long-term halo effect to that historic flooding in South Carolina? Is there something we need to be careful of or think about now in the wake of that?
Well, you know, the price tag is yet to come in. We don't know what that will cost. And
any estimates?
Somebody said earlier that may give some people some cover to try to repair that or address some solutions. The whole tourism, you know, it's a tourism in both North and South Carolina, both $20 billion businesses. And we've got to make sure that that word is out, that roads are passable, we can get there. You know, most of the problems are not coastal, which is kind of the central point of tourism in South Carolina. But you know, it'll be interesting to see just how big that price tag is, and whether or not it does give some cover, as you say, to solving this funding
Any
crisis.
estimates how much of a liability that's going to be?
Don't have any idea, but it's, you know, if the bigness comes in adding it to the deferred maintenance we already have there. That's what really makes it big.
Yeah, good point. Well said. David, thanks for being on the program. I'm sorry it only took us about a decade to get you back, but I'm glad you've been patient.
Well, I'm glad I could be around a decade later.
Yeah, true. Nice to see you. Thank you very much. Jeff, good to see you again. Thank you.
Great to be here again.
Grady, always good to have you on the program.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for watching us. Next week on the program, 2nd Congressional District Representative from South Carolina, Joe Wilson, will be here. Until then, I'm Chris William. For all of us, we hope you have a nice weekend. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.